The snow fell heavy outside the windows of the Harrison Ranch house that winter evening in 1932. Inside the kitchen still held the warmth of supper, though the plates had long been cleared away. Tommy Harrison sat at the wooden table, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, watching his grandfather by the fireplace. Wade Harrison was 85 years old, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading weather and livestock and the character of men. Between his weathered hands, he held a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, the handwriting inside faded, but still legible. Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he set down his cup. Not from the cold, from fear. Tomorrow his brother Walter would arrive from Denver. Walter the lawyer, Walter the success, Walter who everyone said would inherit the ranch because he had prospects, because he'd made something of himself, because he was the smart one. And Tommy was just the boy who'd come home when the Depression took his job in Chicago. The one without education or prospects. The one who mucked stalls and mended fences because there was nothing else left for him. "Grandfather," Tommy said quietly, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire, "I know you're going to choose Walter. He deserves it. He's smarter. He's successful. He made something of himself." Wade looked up from the journal. His face carved deep with lines from decades under the Wyoming sun showed no expression. "Deserves it." Wade repeated the words slow and measured. He opened the journal and Tommy could see a woman's handwriting flowing across the pages. "Let me tell you about the person who taught me what that word really means." Tommy leaned forward despite himself. Wade's voice dropped into the cadence of memory, of story of something carried across half a century. Summer of 1883. There was a woman who came to this ranch. I turned her down just by looking at her. Didn't ask her name. Didn't ask about her experience. Just looked at her body and made my decision. He paused, his finger tracing a line in the journal. She left me a PO. In one sentence. Wade looked up, and for the first time that evening, something like a smile touched his weathered face. "If my size offends you, sir, don't taste my food." Tommy felt his breath catch. "That evening," Wade continued, "I tasted one bite of that pie, and it changed everything. Not just about who I was as a man, but this ranch, my whole life." The old man closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, younger somehow, carried back across 49 years to a different summer, a different man, a different world. "Let me tell you about Clara Bennett." The fire crackled, the snow fell, and Wade Harrison began to speak. July of 1883 came to Thornfield, Wyoming territory like a punishment from an angry god. The heat pressed down on the high plains with a weight that seemed physical, solid, unrelenting. The kind of heat that shimmered the air over the sagebrush and turned the distant mountains into wavering mirages that seemed to float above the earth. It was the kind of season that tested everything: cattle, crops, and the people trying to survive both. Clara Bennett arrived on the Thursday afternoon stage with everything she owned tied into a canvas satchel and a carefully wrapped pie balanced in her arms. The driver gave her a look when she climbed down. Not cruel, just pitying. The kind of look she'd seen 1,000 times before in a dozen towns just like this one. She was 34 years old. A large woman with strong, capable hands and a face that was plain but kind. Her dress clung to her in the heat, and she could feel the eyes of passers-by tracking her movement down the street. She was used to the eyes. Thornfield was a ranching town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast and judged it by noon. Main Street was a mix of false-fronted buildings and practical storefronts. A mercantile with soap and saddles in the window. A saloon where men gathered in the shade even at this hour. A church with white paint peeling in long strips. A land office that doubled as a hiring post for seasonal work. Clara had seen a dozen towns just like it. She walked past the saloon where men loitered in whatever shade they could find. Their conversations died as she passed. She felt their eyes on her back, heard the low murmur of commentary she learned long ago not to acknowledge. Her size had always been the first thing people noticed about her. Not her hands, which were strong and knew their work. Not her face, which smiled easily when given reason. Not her shine, which was sharp and practical, and had kept her alive through 12 years of cooking in places that would have broken lesser souls. Just her body, as if it were the only thing that mattered. The posting board outside the land office held 3 notices, each pinned with a bent nail and curling at the edges from the heat. A ranch hand position. Already filled, someone had scrawled across the bottom. A seamstress job that paid in room and board only. And a third notice, newer than the others, the paper still crisp white against the weathered wood. Trail cook needed. Thornfield Ranch summer drive. Pay listed as fair. Requirements simple. Experience, reliability, and the ability to handle a crew of 30 men through long days and rough terrain. Clara had all 3. She'd cooked in logging camps in Oregon, where the men came in from the forest with axes and hunger and little patience for anything in between. She'd fed mining operations in Nevada, where the silver paid well, but the conditions killed men weekly. She'd worked cattle outfits across Montana, where the drive stretched for months and the weather tried to murder you with heat or cold depending on its mood. She knew how to stretch beans and bacon into something men would line up for twice. She knew how to work a Dutch oven over an open fire and wind that could knock a horse sideways. She knew her craft, but she also knew what would happen when she walked into that office. Still, she went. The Thornfield Ranch office was attached to a small house on the edge of town, neat and well kept, with a covered porch and a hitching post out front. A black gelding stood tied there, tail swishing at flies, its saddle worn smooth with years of use. Clara climbed the steps and knocked. "Come in." The voice was deep, clipped, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. She pushed open the door and stepped into a room that smelled like leather and old paper. A large desk dominated the space, covered in ledgers and shipping notices and calculations that spoke of a ranch running close to the margins. Behind it sat a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile. His dark hair was cropped short, his jaw shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his hands, scarred and capable, rested flat on the desk like he was bracing himself against the weight of something invisible. Wade Harrison looked up when she entered. His expression didn't change. Not surprise, not disdain, just a flatness that was somehow worse than either. "Help you?" he asked. Clara kept her voice steady even though her heart was not. "I'm here about the cook position for the summer drive." Wade's gaze moved over her once, quick and assessing. She saw the decision forming behind his eyes before he even spoke. "Position's demanding," he said carefully. "Long hours, rough conditions, heat like we're having now, sometimes worse. Men get restless when the work's hard and the food's bad." "I've worked trail drives before," Clara said. "Logging camps too. I can handle rough conditions." "I'm sure you can." His tone was polite, almost kind, which made it worse. "But I need someone who can keep pace. The drive starts in 2 weeks and we'll be moving cattle for near 3 months. It's hard on everyone." Translation: "It's too hard for someone like you." Clara had heard every version of this conversation. Sometimes they dressed it up with concern for her well-being. Sometimes they just said no outright. Wade Harrison was trying to be decent about it, which almost made her angrier. "I'm not asking for special consideration," she said quietly. "Just a fair chance to prove what I can do." Wade shifted in his chair. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Discomfort, maybe. Guilt. But it passed quickly. "I appreciate you coming by, Miss—" He paused. "Bennett. Clara Bennett." "Miss Bennett." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I wish you well, but I don't think this is the right fit." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Clara felt the familiar sting settle into her chest, the same one she'd felt in a dozen offices in a dozen towns. She could have argued, could have listed her experience, her references, the men who'd vouched for her skill in writing and would vouch again if asked. But she'd learned that once someone saw your body as a problem, no amount of words would change their mind. So instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out the pie she'd baked that morning in the boarding house kitchen. It was simple, apple and cinnamon, the crust golden and latticed. But she'd made it with the same care she brought to everything she cooked. She set it on his desk, right on top of a shipping manifest. Wade looked at it, then at her, confusion creasing his brow. Clara met his eyes. Her voice was calm as a drawn blade. "If my size offends you, Mr. Harrison," she said, "then don't taste my food." She turned and walked out before he could respond. The boarding house where Clara had taken a room was run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway. a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who asked too many questions and listened to all the answers. The room was small but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that overlooked the street. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and untied her boots. Her hands were steady even though her chest felt tight. She'd known this would happen. She always knew. But some stubborn part of her kept hoping that one day someone would look past the surface and see what she could actually do. A knock came at the door. "Supper's in an hour," Mrs. Calloway called through the wood. "You eating downstairs or taking a tray?" "Downstairs," Clara said. She wasn't hungry, but hiding in her room wouldn't change anything. The dining room was crowded that evening, ranch hands from nearby outfits, a traveling salesman with dust on his coat and hope in his eyes, a pair of surveyors passing through on their way to the railhead. Clara took a seat at the far end of the table and kept her eyes on her plate while conversation flowed around her. "Heard Harrison's still looking for a trail cook," one of the ranch hands said, shoveling beans into his mouth. "Drive starts soon. He's cutting it close." "He turned down some woman today," another man said, smirking. "Big gal thought she could handle a crew." Laughter rippled down the table. Clara's fork stilled against her plate. "Probably for the best," the first man said. "Wade's got enough to worry about without some gal slowing things down." "She baked him a pie, though," the salesman said, grinning. "Heard about that. Bold move." "Bold or desperate," someone else muttered. More laughter. Mrs. Calloway appeared at Clara's elbow with a coffee pot. Her expression was tight, angry on Clara's behalf in a way that only made it hurt more. "More coffee, dear." "No, thank you." Clara stood, her appetite gone. "I think I'll turn in early." She climbed the stairs to her room and sat by the window watching the street below as the light faded and the town settled into evening. Somewhere out there, Wade Harrison was probably finishing his own supper. The pie she'd left him still sitting untouched on his desk. She told herself it didn't matter, but the ache in her chest said otherwise. Bring. Wade Harrison didn't go home that night until well after dark. He'd spent the evening going over supply lists, checking an inventory, trying to ignore the pie sitting on his desk. It sat there like an accusation, the scent of it filling the small office until he couldn't think about anything else. Finally, when the lamplight was burning low and his eyes were tired from squinting at ledgers in the dim glow, he gave in. He pulled the pie toward him, cut a small slice, lifted it to his mouth. The first bite stopped him cold. The crust was perfect, flaky and buttery with just enough sweetness to balance the tarred apples inside. The filling was spiced with cinnamon and something else he couldn't name, something that made the flavors deeper, richer. It wasn't just good, it was the kind of good that made you remember things you tried to forget. He took another bite, slower this time, and suddenly he was somewhere else. He was in his own kitchen 3 years ago watching his wife Emma roll out dough on the counter, flour dusting her hands in her apron. She'd been laughing about something. He couldn't remember what. And the house had smelled like this, like warmth and safety and a life that felt whole. Then she was gone. Cholera had taken her in 4 brutal days. No time to say goodbye properly. No time for anything except watching helplessness turn to grief, and grief turn to anger, and anger turn to the cold, empty thing that had lived in his chest ever since. The kitchen was empty. The house was empty. And Wade was alone with a ledger full of debts and a ranch that demanded everything he had left. He set the fork down and pressed his palms against the desk, his throat tight. The pie was still there, half-eaten, perfect. And the woman who'd made it was somewhere in town, probably packing her bag to leave on tomorrow's stage. He judged her without giving her a chance, without even asking her name, really. He'd looked at her body and had made a decision based on nothing but assumption and the same small-minded thinking he had always hated in other people. Shame crawled up his spine, hot and familiar. He thought about Emma, who'd never judged anyone by sight, who'd taught him that people were more than what you saw on the surface, that kindness and skill mattered more than appearances. He'd forgotten that. Or maybe he'd just stopped caring. Wade pushed back from the desk and stood. The chair scraped against the floor. It was late, too late to fix this tonight. But come morning, he'd find Clara Bennett and do what he should have done from the start. He'd ask for a second chance, and he'd offer her the respect she deserved. Dawn came early to Thornfield, the sky brightening to pale gold that promised another scorching day. Wade was up before the sun, saddling his black gelding and riding into town while the streets were still quiet. He found Clara at a roadside stand near the edge of town. She'd set up a small table with a hand-painted sign, "Home cooking, fair prices." A few men stood nearby, eating and talking in low voices. The smell of fresh bread hung in the air. Wade dismounted and tied his horse, then walked over slowly, hat in hand. Clara saw him coming and stiffened, but she didn't look away. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Harrison." Her voice was even, controlled. Wade stopped at a respectful distance, aware that the men at the stand were watching. "I owe you an apology." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. "I judged you yesterday without giving you a fair chance," Wade continued. "That was wrong." He paused, searching for the right words. "I tasted your pie last night." Another pause. Longer this time. "It reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That skill and heart matter more than appearances." The silence stretched between them. One of the men at the stand coughed. A horse stamped its hoof somewhere down the street. "And," Wade said quietly, "I'd like to offer you the position, if you're still interested." Clara crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "Why now, Amaranto?" she asked. "What changed?" Wade met her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he let someone see past the walls he'd built. "I remembered what it feels like to be wrong," he said, "and I don't want to be that man." Clara studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for something. Sincerity, maybe, or proof that this wasn't just another polite lie. Finally, she nodded once. "I'll take the job." She paused. "But I don't work for pity, Mr. Harrison. I work for respect. If you can't give me that, we're done before we start." "You'll have it," Wade said. "You have my word." "Then we have an agreement." She held out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of someone who knew work. As Wade rode back toward the ranch, the morning sun climbing higher, he felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the first small crack in the armor he'd been wearing since Emma died. And back at the roadside stand, Clara Bennett packed up her table and allowed herself the smallest smile. She'd been turned away 100 times, but this time someone had come back. The Thornfield Ranch sat 10 miles outside town, sprawling across a valley, bordered by pine-covered hills, and a creek that ran cold and clear even in the height of summer. It was a working ranch, practical, not pretty, a main house, a bunkhouse, a barn, and a series of corrals where cattle milled and horses stamped in the heat. When Clara arrived 2 days later, riding in the back of a supply wagon, the ranch hands stopped what they were doing and stared. She climbed down carefully, her satchel in one hand, and surveyed the place she'd be calling home for the next 3 months. The cookhouse was a low building near the bunkhouse. Stone chimney, covered porch where supplies were stacked in crates. It wasn't much, but she'd worked in worse. Wade walked over from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Miss Bennett, welcome." "Thank you." She gestured toward the cookhouse. "Mind if I take a look inside?" "Go ahead. If you need anything, let me know." The interior was dim and smelled like old smoke and grease. There was a cast iron stove, a long work table, shelves lined with tin plates and cups, and a pantry stocked with the basics: flour beans, salt pork, dried apples. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional. Clara set down her satchel and rolled up her sleeves. By noon, she'd scrubbed the stove, reorganized the pantry, and started a batch of sourdough starter. By evening, she prepared her first meal for the crew: beef stew with vegetables, fresh biscuits, and dried apple cobbler. When the men filed in for supper, the talk died down as they saw her standing behind the serving line, ladle in hand. Wade was the first to step forward. "Smells good," he said. "Thank you." Clara filled his plate without meeting his eyes, then moved on to the next man. One by one the hands came through, some nodding politely, others muttering thanks, a few saying nothing at all. She felt their scrutiny, heard the whispers that followed her like shadows. But when they tasted the food, the room went quiet. Not the hostile silence of judgment, but the stunned silence of men who hadn't expected this. One of the older hands, a grizzled man named Silas Grant, looked up from his plate with wide eyes. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this is the best stew I've had in 10 years. A few others nodded agreement, and the tension in the room eased. Just a fraction. Clara allowed herself a small breath of relief. It was a start. The first week passed in a blur of heat and hard work. Clara rose before dawn to start the cook fire, prepared 3 meals a day for 30 men, and cleaned up long after the sun had set. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached from bending over the stove. But she didn't complain. The men began to warm to her slowly. Silas became a regular visitor to the cookhouse, offering to help carry water or chop wood. His weathered face always creased in what might have been a smile. A young hand named Ben Walker started lingering after meals, asking shy questions about how she made her biscuits so light. He was 19 years old with a face that still carried the softness of boyhood and eyes that got distant when he talked about Kansas. But not everyone was convinced. There was a man named Marsh Dalton, lean and sharp-eyed. He watched her with open skepticism. Never said anything directly, but Clara could feel his doubt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. And then there was the town. Word had spread that Wade Harrison had hired a woman, a large woman, as his trail cook, and the gossip had taken on a life of its own. Women at the mercantile whispered behind their hands when Clara came in for supplies. Men at the saloon made jokes that drifted out into the street. Clara ignored it all. She'd learned long ago that the only thing that she could control was her work. Late one evening after the crew had finished supper and dispersed, Wade stopped by the cookhouse. Clara was washing dishes in a basin of soapy water, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. "Need any help?" he asked from the doorway. "I'm fine, thank you." He stepped inside anyway, picking up a towel and drying the plates she'd set aside. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the splash of water and the clink of dishes. "The men are eating better than they have in years," Wade said finally. "I wanted you to know that." "They're easy to please," Clara said. "Good ingredients, honest cooking. That's all it takes." "It's more than that." He set down a dried plate and looked at her. "You've brought something back to this place, something I didn't realize we'd lost." Clara paused, her hands stilling in the water. "What's that, a sense of home?" The words hung between them, quiet and weighty. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She pulled the plug from the basin and watched the dirty water drain away, then dried her hands on her apron. "Thank you for the second chance, Mr. Harrison," she said softly. "Wade," he corrected, "and you've earned it." He left the cookhouse, and Clara stood alone in the dim light, her heart beating a little faster than it should. For the first time in a long time, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to stay. The following morning brought clouds that promised rain but delivered only oppressive humidity. Clara woke in her small room attached to the cookhouse, barely more than a storage closet with a cot and a washstand, and listened to the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Boots on wooden planks, horses nickering in the corral, men's voices calling back and forth in the pre-dawn darkness. She dressed quickly and lit the stove, working by lamplight to start the day's bread. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, kneading, shaping, setting the loaves to rise, while her mind wandered back to Wade's words from the night before. A sense of home. She'd stopped believing in that years ago. Home meant staying in one place long enough to put down roots, and Clara had learned that roots required ground willing to hold them. Every town, every job, every promise of this time will be different had ended the same way, with her packing her satchel and moving on before the judgment turned to cruelty. But something about this place felt different. Maybe it was Wade's quiet sincerity. Maybe it was the way old Silas had started leaving wildflowers on the cookhouse steps, prairie roses and Indian paintbrush tied with twine. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of always running. Whatever it was, Clara found herself hoping again, and hope was dangerous. The first hands arrived for breakfast as the sky lightened to gray. Ben came in rubbing sleep from his eyes, followed by 3 others whose names Clara was still learning. They filled their plates with fried potatoes, bacon, and the biscuits she'd made fresh that morning, then settled at the long table in companionable silence. Marsh entered last, his sharp gaze sweeping the room before landing on Clara. He took his plate without a word and sat apart from the others, eating mechanically while he watched her move between the stove and the serving line. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny like a hand pressed against her spine. When the breakfast shift ended and the men headed out to their various tasks, Marsh lingered. He carried his empty plate to the wash basin and set it down with deliberate care. "You're keeping up better than I expected," he said. His tone wasn't quite friendly, but it wasn't hostile either, just observational. "Thank you," Clara replied carefully. "The drive's going to be harder, though." Marsh paused. "Long days, short supplies, men who get mean when they're tired." Another pause. "You sure you're ready for that?" It was a fair question, but the way he asked it with that edge of doubt threading through every word made it feel like a test. "I've worked drives before," Clara said. "I know what to expect." Marsh studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once and left. Clara exhaled slowly and turned back to her work, but the conversation stayed with her. Marsh wasn't wrong. The real test wasn't feeding men in a stationary cookhouse with a full pantry. It was keeping them fed and functional on the trail, where everything was harder and nothing went according to plan. She had 2 weeks to prove she could do it. By midday, the sky had darkened further, and the first drops of rain began to fall. It started as a drizzle, then built into a steady downpour that turned the ranch yard into a sea of mud. The men who'd been working in the far pastures came back soaked and irritable, tracking dirt across the cookhouse floor. Clara set out towels and kept coffee brewing while she prepared the midday meal. The rain drummed against the roof in a relentless rhythm, and the air inside grew thick and close despite the open windows. Wade appeared in the doorway, water dripping from his hat brim. "Rode into town's washed out," he said. "Supply wagon won't make it through until tomorrow at the earliest." Clara glanced at her pantry. She'd been counting on that wagon to replenish her flour and sugar. "How much are we short?" "Enough to matter." He stepped inside, shaking water from his coat. "Can you make do?" She mentally cataloged what she had left: beans, rice, salt, pork, a few pounds of cornmeal, dried fruit, some molasses. Not much, but not nothing. "I can stretch it," she said. "Meals might be simpler for a day or two." "Whatever you need to do." He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that looked like trust. "I know you'll figure it out." After he left, Clara stood in the quiet cookhouse and let herself feel the weight of that trust. It was a small thing maybe, but it mattered more than he knew. She adjusted her plans. Dinner that night became bean and rice soup with cornbread, the kind of meal that filled bellies without requiring much in the way of fancy ingredients. She added bacon fat for flavor and a handful of dried peppers for heat, then let it simmer while she mixed the cornbread batter. When the men came in that evening, wet and tired, they didn't complain. They ate gratefully, scraping their bowls clean and reaching for seconds. Even Marsh, who usually ate with the air of a man merely tolerating sustenance, looked almost satisfied. "This is good," Ben said, his young face earnest. "Real good, Miss Bennett." "Thank you, Ben." "My ma used to make soup like this," he continued, a note of homesickness creeping into his voice. "Back in Kansas before the drought." Clara's chest tightened. She'd seen that look on too many young faces. Boys barely old enough to shave working ranches hundreds of miles from home because there was nothing left for them where they came from. "I'm glad it reminds you of her cooking," she said gently. Ben ducked his head and went back to eating. But when he left that evening, he touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect that felt like a small victory. The rain continued through the night and into the next day. The ranch turned into a muddy labyrinth. Tempers grew short. A fight broke out in the barn over a missing saddle blanket. One of the horses threw a shoe and had to be reshod in the pouring rain. And still the supply wagon didn't come. Clara made do with what she had. Breakfast became cornmeal mush with molasses. Lunch was leftover cornbread and bacon. Dinner was more bean soup, this time thickened with the last of her rice. She saw the men's patience beginning to fray, heard the muttered complaints about prison food and another damn pot of beans. But no one said anything to her face, and the bowl still came back empty. On the third day, the rain finally stopped. The sun broke through the clouds in the late afternoon, turning the mud to steam and painting the hills gold. And just before sunset, the supply wagon rumbled up the road, its wheels caked in dried muck. Clara supervised the unloading personally, checking every sack of flour and crate of vegetables. The driver, a grizzled man named Horace, gave her a gap-toothed grin. "Heard you've been keeping the boys fed on nothing but air and grit," he said. "That true, close enough." Clara replied, signing off on the delivery. But we managed. That evening she made a feast, roasted chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, biscuits so light they practically floated, and apple pie for dessert. The men came in tired and hungry, and when they saw the spread laid out, a cheer went up. The atmosphere in the cookhouse shifted. Laughter replaced the sullen silence of the previous days. Men swapped stories and teased each other good-naturedly. Even Marsh cracked a smile when Ben challenged him to see who could eat the most biscuits. Wade came in last, as he often did, and stood in the doorway taking in the scene, when his eyes found Clara's across the crowded room. He nodded once, a gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement that needed no words. Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest, dangerous and unfamiliar. After the meal, when the men had drifted back to the bunkhouse and the dishes were washed, Wade returned to the cookhouse. He found Clara sitting on the back steps watching the stars emerge in the clearing sky. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "It's your ranch." "Still your space." But he sat down anyway, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while they just sat in silence, listening to the night sounds. Crickets, a distant owl, the soft shuffle of horses in the barn. "You handled the shortage well," Wade said finally. "Some cooks would have panicked or made excuses. You just did the work." "Not much else to do," Clara replied. "There's always something else to do." He turned to look at her. "You could have complained, could have blamed the weather or the supplier or me for not planning better." He paused. "But you didn't. You just solved the problem." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she watched the stars instead. A meteor streaked across the sky, brief and bright. The trail drive started in 6 days. The real test was coming. Tommy looked up from the journal, his eyes wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. The fire had burned low in the ranch house. The snow outside had stopped. And Wade Harrison sat watching his grandson with something that might have been hope in his ancient eyes. "She never gave up," Tommy said softly, "even when they doubted her, even when it was hard." "Your grandmother," Wade said, "did not give up once in 49 years. Not when the work was hard, not when people judged her, not when it would have been easier to quit." He leaned forward slightly. "She just solved problems. That's what she did." "What happened next?" Tommy asked. "On the drive?" Wade's face grew grave, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Everything that could go wrong," he said quietly, "did." He placed his hand on the journal, on Clara's handwriting, on the record of a summer that had tested them both and forged something neither of them had expected. But that's a story for tomorrow, son. When your brother arrives and we talk about what this ranch needs. What it's always needed. Tommy nodded, but his hand strayed to the journal, to the proof that worth wasn't measured in education or success or the approval of others. It was measured in work done well, in problem solved, in showing up every day even when the world said you didn't belong. Outside, the Wyoming winter held the land in its grip. But inside, by the fire, a different kind of warmth had taken root. The warmth of a story told, of a legacy passed, of a young man beginning to understand that deserving something and earning something were not the same thing at all. Wade stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Get some sleep, Tommy. Tomorrow, your brother comes. And tomorrow we'll see who understands what your grandmother taught me all those years ago." He moved toward the stairs, then paused. "She would have liked you, you know. Clara would have seen what I see. Someone who shows up. Someone who does the work. Someone who doesn't quit just because it's hard." Tommy sat alone with the journal long after Wade had gone to bed, reading Clara's recipes, her notes, her observations about weather and men and the hard business of keeping people fed when everything was against you. And somewhere in those pages, he began to find the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. Not who deserves the ranch, but who will fight for it. The next morning, Wade found Clara already at work in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands deep in flour as she prepared the day's bread. 6 days remained before the drive would begin, and the weight of that deadline hung in the air, like the heat that never seemed to break. He watched her from the doorway for a moment, the economy of her movements, the sureness of her hands. She worked the way good ranch hands rode, with a kind of quiet competence that needed no announcement. "Got time to look at the chuck wagon?" he asked. Clara glanced up, brushing flour from her fingers. "Lead the way." The chuck wagon sat in the barn, its wood weathered but solid. 15 years old, Silas had said, and it looked every day of it. But there was a dignity to the wear, the kind that spoke of useful life rather than neglect. "She's a beauty," Silas said, running a fond hand along the wagon's side as they approached. His weathered face creased into something like a smile. "Been with the ranch near 15 years. Seen me through more drives than I can count." Clara walked around the wagon slowly, her practiced eye taking in every detail. The hinged lid that would open to reveal shelves and compartments. The coffee grinder bolted to one side. The water barrel lashed to the other. The fold-down work surface that would serve as her only prep station for 3 months. "Will she hold up for another one?" Clara asked, running her hand along a crack in one of the wheel spokes. "She'll hold," Silas said. His tone was confident. "Long as we don't push her too hard and keep the weight distributed right." For the next 2 hours, they loaded the wagon together. Heavy items low and centered, lighter goods up high. Flour and beans in barrels that could double as seats. Salt pork wrapped in canvas and buried in a bed of straw to keep it from spoiling in the heat. Dried fruit coffee, molasses baking powder, all carefully packed and labeled. Clara worked methodically, her mind cataloging every item and its location. On the trail, she'd need to find things quickly, often in the dark or in bad weather. Organization now would save her hours of frustration later. While they worked, voices drifted over from the corral where the other hands were sorting horses and checking tack. "Heard there's another outfit heading north same time as us," one hand was saying. "The Bridger Ranch crew. They'll be running parallel for a while." "That's so," it was Marsh's voice, sharp with interest. "They got a decent cook this year. Some old boy named Dutch. Been cooking drives for 30 years from what I hear." A low whistle. 30 years. Our cook's been at it, what, 30 days? Laughter rippled through the group. Clara's hands stilled on the crate she was lifting. She felt Silas stiffen beside her. "She's been cooking professionally longer than you've been alive, Marsh." Silas called out, his voice hard as iron. "Show some respect." The laughter died. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before Marsh responded. "Didn't mean no disrespect, just stating facts." "Then state this fact," Silas said. "Miss Bennett's kept us fed better than we've eaten in 5 years. You got a problem with that, take it up with the boss." No one took it up with the boss, but Clara heard the doubt in their voices, felt it like a stone in her shoe. They were willing to give her credit for feeding them in a well-stocked cookhouse. But the trail was different. The trail would test everything: her stamina, her skill, her ability to perform under pressure. She needed to prove herself all over again. So that evening, a group of women from town arrived at the ranch in a wagon loaded with baskets. Clara was in the cookhouse preparing supper when she heard their voices, high and bright and edged with something that made her instinctively wary. She stepped outside to find Mrs. Constance Whitmore holding court in the ranch yard, surrounded by 4 other well-dressed women. Mrs. Whitmore was the wife of Thornfield's banker, a woman who wore her social position like armor and wielded charity like a weapon. "We've brought provisions for the men," Mrs. Whitmore was saying to Wade, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Cakes, preserves, some of my special molasses cookies. I know how hard trail work can be, and we wanted to ensure they're properly cared for." "That's generous of you, ma'am," Wade said carefully, "but Miss Bennett has the provisions well in hand." "Oh, I'm sure she does her best." Mrs. Whitmore's smile was all teeth. "But there's a difference between filling bellies and truly nourishing men, don't you think? These boys deserve the comforts of home before they head out into the wilderness." Clara's jaw tightened. She recognized this game. The polite undermining, the suggestion that her work was adequate but not special. The implication that a real woman, a proper woman, would do better. She stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, ladies, thank you for thinking of the men. I'm sure they'll appreciate the treats." Mrs. Whitmore's gaze slid over Clara like oil on water, taking in her work-worn dress, her flour-dusted apron, her large frame that filled the doorway of the cookhouse. "Miss Bennett," she said, her voice dripping false sympathy, "how industrious you are taking on such demanding work. I do hope you're not overdoing it. A woman of your constitution needs to be careful not to overtax herself." The other women made soft, agreeing noises. "I appreciate your concern," Clara said evenly, "but I'm quite capable." "Oh, I'm sure you believe that." Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried across the yard. But belief and reality are such different things, aren't they? Why, I was just saying to Margaret here, she gestured to one of the other women, that it seems almost cruel to expect a woman to manage trail cooking. All that heavy lifting and rough living, it's men's work, really. Then it's lucky I'm being paid like a man, Clara replied. One of the younger women in the group stifled a laugh. Mrs. Whitmore's smile grew brittle. Well, we all make our choices, don't we? She turned back to Wade. Mr. Harrison, shall we bring these baskets to the cookhouse, or would you prefer we distribute them directly to the men? The cookhouse is fine, Wade said. His voice was neutral, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders. The women bustled about carrying their baskets into Clara's domain and exclaiming over how quaint everything was. How rustic. How charmingly primitive. They left their gifts on the work table like offerings at a shrine, then departed in a cloud of perfume and pointed remarks about how tired Clara must be. When they were gone, Clara stood alone in the cookhouse surrounded by their charity, her hands clenched into fists. Wade appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry about that, he said. You should have what? Clara cut him off. Told them not to come, defended my honor, sent them away empty-handed. She shook her head. They're your neighbors, your community. You need them more than you need to protect my feelings. That's not true. Isn't it? She gestured at the baskets. They came here to remind me that I don't belong. That no matter how well I cook or how hard I work, I'll never be one of them. She paused. And they're right. Clara, don't. She held up a hand. I've heard all the reassurances before. You're different. You're better. You see past the surface. But when it comes down to it, you'll always be part of their world, and I'll always be passing through. Wade stepped into the room. His face was harder than she'd ever seen it. You think I belong to their world? He asked. You think I sit in their parlors, drinking tea and playing their games? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm as much an outsider as you are, Clara, just for different reasons. She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she'd missed before. The isolation, the way he held himself apart from everyone, not out of pride, but out of protection. What happened? She asked softly. Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. My wife died 3 years ago, cholera. We'd only been married 4 years. His voice was flat, reciting facts. After she was gone, the town tried to help, brought food, offered condolences, invited me to socials. All kindness on the surface, but underneath it was judgment. Yes, he paused. I should have gotten her to a doctor sooner, should have been more careful about the water, should have protected her better. That wasn't your fault, Clara said. Tell that to Mrs. Whitmore and her friends. His mouth twisted. They stopped inviting me to things after I made it clear I wasn't interested in being set up with their daughters. And when I threw myself into work instead of grief, when I didn't perform my mourning the way they expected, they decided I was cold. Unfeeling, a man who'd already forgotten his wife. Had you? Clara asked quietly. No. The word was raw. But I couldn't wear my grief like a badge for their inspection. Couldn't let them turn Emma's death into entertainment for their tea parties. He met Clara's eyes. So I understand what it's like to be judged by people who don't know you, to be measured against expectations you never agreed to. Clara sank into the chair across from him. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, and for what they put you through. And I'm sorry they came here to undermine you, Wade replied. But don't think for 1 second that I need them more than I need someone I can trust to do their job well and treat people with decency. He stood. You've earned your place here, Clara. Don't let them convince you otherwise. He left before she could respond. Clara sat alone in the cookhouse, surrounded by the town women's charity, and felt something shift in her understanding of Wade Harrison. He wasn't just a rancher who'd given her a second chance. He was a man who knew what it felt like to be on the outside looking in, who understood that judgment could come dressed in kindness and still cut just as deep. She stood and began unpacking the baskets. The cakes would keep for a few days, the preserves could go in his chuck wagon, and the molasses cookies she tasted one, and had to admit they were good, would make a nice surprise for the men at tomorrow's breakfast. Mrs. Whitmore and her friends might have meant their charity as a slight, but Clara would turn it into something useful. That's what she always did. took what the world offered, even when it was offered with contempt, and made something nourishing from it. It was the only way she knew how to survive. The drive began on a Tuesday morning when the sky was still dark and the air held the last cool breath of night. Clara had been awake since 3, loading the final supplies into the chuck wagon by lantern light. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking and rechecking every strap, every barrel, every item that would sustain 30 men through the brutal Wyoming summer. The cattle were already moving, a river of brown and white flowing north under the guidance of the outriders. She could hear them in the distance, the low bellow of steers, the sharp whistle of the drovers, the thunder of 3,000 hooves striking earth. The sound made her chest tight with something between excitement and fear. Silas appeared beside the wagon, his weathered face creased with concern. "You got everything you need. Everything I could fit." Clara climbed up onto the wagon seat and took the reins. The 2 mules hitched to the wagon's sturdy creatures named Ruth and Naomi shifted their weight but didn't spook. "I'll follow the herd at a distance," Clara said. "Set up camp wherever Wade says. He'll pick good spots, always does." Silas hesitated, then added, "Don't let the boys give you grief. They're good men mostly, but they get ornery when the work's hard." "I can handle ornery." "I know you can." He touched his hat brim. "But if anyone crosses a line, you tell me. Or better yet, tell Wade." Clara nodded, though she had no intention of running to anyone with complaints. She'd fight her own battles, same as always. The wagon lurched forward as she urged the mules into motion. The sky was beginning to lighten, pale gold spreading across the eastern horizon. Behind her, the ranch buildings grew smaller, then disappeared entirely as the road curved into open country. For the first few hours, the work was almost peaceful. The wagon rolled along a well-worn trail, the moles plodding steadily, while Clara divided her attention between the road ahead and the mental calculations of her first trail meal. The men would be hungry when they stopped for midday, ravenous from the early start and the hard work of keeping the herd moving. She'd need something quick and filling. Beans that had been soaking overnight, bacon fried crisp, cornbread if she could get the fire hot enough. The sun climbed higher and the temperature climbed with it. By mid-morning, sweat was running down Clara's back, soaking through her dress, despite the wide-brimmed hat she'd borrowed from the ranch. The heat shimmered off the prairie in waves, turning the distant hills into mirages that seemed to float above the earth. When Wade finally called the midday halt, Clara had been watching for a good spot for the last hour. He chose a place near a creek, shallow but running clear, with enough flat ground for the wagon and enough grass for the herd to graze. The cattle spread out across the meadow like a living blanket, while the men dismounted and led their horses to water. Clara had the fire going before most of them had unsaddled. She worked quickly, her movements economical, setting the heavy Dutch oven over the coals and laying strips of bacon in a skillet. The smell rose into the hot air, and she saw heads turn toward the chuck wagon. Ben was the first to approach, his young face red from sun and exertion. "Miss Bennett, can I help with anything?" "Water," she said, nodding toward the barrels lashed to the wagon. "Fill the coffee pot and the wash basin." He hurried to comply, grateful for something to do. Other men began drifting over, some to help, others just to stand in the shade of the wagon and watch her work. She felt their eyes on her, measuring, judging, waiting to see if she'd falter. She didn't. The beans came together quickly, seasoned with bacon, fat, and a pinch of dried peppers. The cornbread went into the Dutch oven, the lid covered with coals to create even heat. Coffee boiled in the big pot strong enough to strip paint. Within 40 minutes of stopping, she was ladling food onto tin plates, while the men lined up with the patient hunger of people who knew good cooking when they smelled it. Wade came through last as usual. He took his plate and met her eyes. "Holding up. All right. It'll get harder." "I know." He nodded once and moved off to eat with the others. Clara watched him go, then turned her attention to the cleanup. The dishes had to be washed, the fire banked, everything secured before the herd started moving again. She worked steadily, ignoring the ache in her back and the burn in her shoulders. They were back on the trail within 2 hours. The afternoon was worse than the morning. The heat became crushing, pressing down like a physical weight. Dust rose from the cattle and the horses, coating everything in a fine grit that worked its way into clothes, hair, eyes, mouth. Clara tied a bandana over her nose and mouth and kept the mules moving, following the herd's slow progress across the endless prairie. When they finally stopped for the night, the sun was sinking toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and red. Clara's arms shook as she set the brake and climbed down from the wagon. Her dress was plastered to her body with sweat. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She allowed herself 30 seconds to stand still and breathe. Then she got to work. Evening camp was more elaborate than the midday stop. The men needed a substantial meal to recover from the day's labor and fuel them for tomorrow. Clara had planned beef stew with vegetables, biscuits, and dried apple compote for dessert. It was ambitious for trail cooking, but she promised herself she wouldn't cut corners just because the work was hard. She built the fire up hot and set water to boil while she chopped onions and carrots. The beef had been cooking slowly all afternoon in a covered pot wedged between supply crates in the wagon. Now she added the vegetables and adjusted the seasoning, tasting and adjusting until the flavors married properly. The biscuit dough came together in a large bowl, flour, baking powder, salt, lard, and just enough water to bind it. She rolled it out on the wagon's drop-down work surface and cut rounds with an old tin cup, then arranged them in a Dutch oven. By the time the first stars were appearing, the smell of baking bread was drifting across the camp. Men began gathering around the chuck wagon like moths to lamplight. They came in small groups, talking quietly among themselves, their faces shadowed with exhaustion. Some sat on the ground, others leaned against wagon wheels or saddles. They waited without complaint, used to the rhythm of trail life, where everything happened in its own time. When Clara finally rang the triangle, a piece of iron that hung from the wagon, and served as the dinner bell, the line formed quickly. She served each man with the same care she'd shown back at the ranch, making sure portions were generous and fair. No one got special treatment. No one got shortchanged. The first man to taste the stew stopped, mid-chew, his eyes widening. "Lord have mercy," he breathed. "This is good." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Even Marsh, who'd been watching her all day with that sharp, assessing gaze, looked grudgingly impressed as he cleaned his plate. Clara felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. First day done, she'd proven she could handle the work. But she knew better than to relax. One good meal didn't make a successful drive. There would be harder days ahead. The second day brought the heat wave. Clara woke before dawn to find the air already warm and oppressive, heavy with moisture that promised no relief. The sky was hazy, the stars obscured by a film of humidity that made everything feel closer, more suffocating. She started breakfast in the dark, working by feel and long practice. Oatmeal with dried fruit and molasses. Bacon. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The men stumbled to the chuck wagon, looking haggard, some of them already showing the red flush of too much sun. "Drink plenty of water today," Clara told each man as she handed him his plate. "Heat like this will drop you faster than anything else." Most nodded their understanding. A few younger hands looked at her like she was fussing unnecessarily. She made a mental note to watch those ones especially close. The herd moved slower in the heat. The cattle were restless, balking at the pace, and the drovers had to work twice as hard to keep them moving in the right direction. Dust hung in the air like fog, coating everything, making it hard to breathe. Clara followed in the wagon, rationing water carefully and planning modifications to the midday meal. Something lighter, she decided. Something that wouldn't sit heavy in stomachs already stressed by heat. But when they stopped at noon, she found her supplies running lower than expected. Someone had gotten into the stores probably last night while she slept and helped themselves to a significant portion of her dried beef and a whole wheel of cheese. Clara stood in the wagon bed staring at the depleted supplies and felt anger kindle in her chest. Food theft on a trail drive wasn't just dishonest, it was dangerous. Supplies were calculated, carefully portioned to last the entire journey. Taking more than your share meant someone else would go without. She climbed down and found Wade watering his horse. "We have a problem." He looked up, reading the tension in her voice. "What kind?" "Someone raided my supplies last night, took near 10 pounds of dried beef and a wheel of cheese." Wade's jaw tightened. "You're sure?" "I inventory every night. The theft happened between last inventory and this morning." He swore quietly and handed his horse's reins to a nearby hand. "Gather the men, everyone who's not riding herd." Within minutes, 20 men stood in a loose circle near the chuck wagon. They looked confused, wary, some already defensive. Wade stood in the center, his posture radiating controlled anger. "Someone stole from the chuck wagon last night," he said without preamble. "Food supplies meant to feed all of us for the next 3 months. That's not just theft. It's endangering every man here." Silence fell. Men shifted uncomfortably, looking at each other with suspicion. "I don't care who did it," Wade continued, "but it doesn't happen again. Miss Bennett works hard to keep us fed. The least we can do is respect her work and ration our shares fairly." His gaze swept the circle. "If I find out who's been helping themselves, they're off this drive and walking back to Thornfield." "Are we clear?" Murmurs of assent, but Clara saw it in their faces. The doubt, the resentment. Some of them thought she was making a fuss over nothing. Others thought she couldn't be trusted to manage supplies properly, and a few looked at her with something uglier, like her presence itself was the problem. The men dispersed and Clara felt the weight of their judgment settle on her shoulders. She'd made an enemy by reporting the theft. Maybe several. But what choice did she have? Let them steal her blind and doom the whole drive. She adjusted her midday meal plans again, stretching what remained to feed everyone adequately. The men ate in silence, the earlier camaraderie replaced by tension. Even Ben seemed subdued, avoiding her eyes as he accepted his portion. The afternoon was brutal. The temperature climbed past anything Clara had experienced, turning the wagon into an oven and the prairie into a furnace. Her water supply dwindled faster than planned because men kept coming to the wagon between shifts desperately thirsty. She gave it freely. She couldn't deny a man water in heat like this, but watched her barrels drop lower and lower with growing concern. They were supposed to reach another creek by evening. If they didn't, or if it was dry, they'd be in serious trouble. 2 hours before sunset, one of the drovers fell from his horse. Clara saw it happen from her position behind the herd. The young man, barely 20, named Owen Fletcher, simply slumped sideways and hit the ground. His horse shied and bolted, and other riders converged on the scene. Wade's sharp whistle cut through the air. The signal to halt the herd. Clara set the wagon's brake and jumped down, grabbing her water bucket and a clean cloth. She ran toward the cluster of men, her skirts hiking up past her ankles, not caring who saw. Owen was conscious, but barely. His skin flushed dangerously red, his eyes unfocused. Heat exhaustion. Maybe heat stroke. Clara had seen it before in the Nevada camps. "Get him in the shade," she ordered, not caring that she was addressing men twice her age. "Now, yeah." They carried him to the wagon's shadow. Clara soaked the cloth in cool water and pressed it to his neck and forehead. "Someone get his boots off. We need to cool him down fast." Wade appeared at her shoulder. "What do you need?" "More water, and if anyone has whiskey, bring it." "Whiskey?" One of the men looked skeptical. Clara didn't look up from Owen, focusing on keeping the cloth cold and wet. "Not to drink, to cool the skin." She raised her voice. "Move." They moved. For the next 20 minutes, Clara worked over Owen with single-minded focus. She bathed his face and neck, got small sips of water into him, monitored his breathing. Gradually, slowly, the dangerous flush began to fade from his skin. His breathing steadied, his eyes focused. "Easy," Clara murmured when he tried to sit up. "You stayed down for a while longer. Let your body recover." "I'm sorry," Owen whispered. "I thought I could push through it." "That's how men die." Her voice was gentle but firm. "You listen to your body out here. It'll tell you when something's wrong." Wade crouched beside his. "Will he be all right?" "If he rests and stays hydrated, but he can't ride for at least a day, maybe 2. We'll put him in the wagon with you." Some of the watching men muttered at that. The chuck wagon was supposed to be for supplies, not passengers. Adding Owen's weight would strain the mules and slow their pace. Clara heard the complaints and ignored them. "He can ride with me. I'll watch him." Wade stood and addressed the gathered men. "Anyone else feeling poorly? You speak up now. I won't have anyone else dropping because they're too stubborn to ask for help." 2 other men reluctantly admitted to dizziness and nausea. Wade assigned them lighter duties and ordered everyone to drink more water. Consequences be damned. They made camp an hour later beside the creek they'd been aiming for. It was running low, but not dry. Enough to refill the barrels and water the herd. Clara worked through her exhaustion to prepare another meal, this time with Owen propped against the wagon wheel under her watchful eye. The men's attitude toward her had shifted again. Some looked at her with new respect, others with resentment that she'd made them look weak by comparison. And Marsh watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite hostile, but not friendly either. She served dinner, cleaned up, and finally collapsed into her tent long after everyone else had bedded down. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were blistered from handling hot pots and rough wood. Her face felt scorched despite the hat. But Owen was alive and recovering, and the men had eaten well despite the theft and the heat and the hard day. She'd managed. Barely, but she'd managed. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of heat and work. The temperature never dropped below punishing. Supplies continued to disappear in small amounts. Never enough to point to definitively, but enough that Clara knew someone was still stealing. She started sleeping lighter, waking at every sound but never caught the thief. The men grew testier. Arguments broke out over petty things. One fistfight had to be broken up by Wade personally. The cattle were skittish and hard to manage. And through it all, Clara cooked 3 meals a day, rationed water, tended to Owen until he was well enough to ride again, and tried to stretch supplies that were shrinking faster than planned. On the 6th day of the drive, the men had gathered for the evening meal, tired and surly, after a day spent chasing strays through rough country. Clara served the food. Beans again because her stores of fresh meat were gone, and she was eking out what remained, and waited for the complaints. They came from a hand named Tucker Hayes, a man in his 30s with a mean streak and a voice that carried. Beans again? He made a show of poking at his plate with disgust. This is the 4th time this week. It's what we have, Clara said evenly. Thought you were supposed to be some kind of expert cook. Tucker's voice dripped contempt. This is slop, prison food. A few other men shifted uncomfortably. No one contradicted him. The supplies are running low because someone keeps stealing from the wagon, Clara said, keeping her voice level. When I have more ingredients, you'll get more variety. Or maybe you just can't cook on the trail like you claimed. Tucker stood his plate still full. Maybe Harrison made a mistake hiring you. The air went taut. Every man in camp was watching now. Clara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the weather. If you don't like the food, don't eat it, she said quietly. More for those who appreciate the work. Appreciate it. Tucker laughed, ugly and sharp. Lady, the only reason we're eating this garbage is because there's nothing else. You want appreciation. Earn it. That's enough. Wade's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stepped into the firelight, his face hard. You gotta complain about the food, Hayes, you bring it to me, not to Miss Bennett. I'm bringing it to you now, boss. Tucker's tone was insinuating. She's not cutting it. We're 6 days in and already running short on supplies. Men are going hungry, getting sick. This ain't working. Wade's voice was dangerously quiet. Men are getting sick because of the heat and their own stubbornness, not because of Miss Bennett's cooking. And we're running short because someone's been stealing. Or did you miss that part? Tucker shrugged. Maybe, or maybe she just can't manage supplies proper. Either way, it's a problem. Wade moved closer to Tucker. Though he wasn't a particularly tall man, something in his bearing made him seem larger. The problem, Wade said, each word deliberate, is men who disrespect someone trying to do an impossible job under impossible conditions. He paused. Miss Bennett has kept us fed through the worst heat wave I've seen in 10 years. She's worked from before dawn to after dark every single day. She's earned her place here 10 times over. Tucker's tone turned ugly. That's your professional opinion, boss? Or is there something else going on? The implication hung in the air like poison. Wade went very still. When he spoke, his voice was soft enough that every man had to strain to hear it. You want to say that again? Hayes makes sure everyone heard you clear. Tucker's courage faltered. He looked around at the other men searching for support but found only silence. Even Marsh, who'd been skeptical of Clara from the start, wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Tucker muttered. No, Wade's voice was flat. You're saying what a small, mean man thinks when he wants to tear someone down rather than admit his own failings. He gestured toward Tucker's still full plate. Miss Bennett put food on your plate, same as everyone else. You don't want to eat it, fine. But you will show respect for her work, or you'll answer to me. Are we clear? Tucker set his jaw. Crystal. Good. Now sit down and eat or go to bed hungry. I don't care which. Tucker grabbed his plate and stalked off into the darkness. The tension broke like a snapped wire and the men returned to their meals, though the conversation stayed muted. Clara stood by the fire, her hands shaking slightly. Wade had defended her. Not in private, not with soft words meant to soothe, but publicly in front of everyone. He'd drawn a line in the dirt and dared anyone to cross it. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, she felt exposed. Because Tucker had said aloud what others were surely thinking, that she wasn't good enough, that her presence here was some kind of favor rather than earned position. And now everyone would be watching even more closely, looking for proof that Tucker was right. Wade approached her after the men had dispersed. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "It's nothing I haven't heard before," Clara said. "That doesn't make it right." He looked at her properly, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired and I'm angry, but I'm not giving up." "I know you're not." He paused. "For what it's worth, everything I said was true. You've done exceptional work." "For a woman, you mean?" "For anyone," Wade said firmly. "I've worked with a dozen trail cooks. You're the best I've seen. Your size, your gender, none of that matters when the food tastes this good and the men are fed on time every single day." Clara wanted to believe him. But years of judgment had taught her that words were easy. Actions were what mattered. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have to thank me for basic decency." And yet here we are. Wade looked like he wanted to say more, but he just nodded and walked back toward his bedroll. Clara turned to the cleanup. The dishes still needed washing. The fire needed banking. Tomorrow's breakfast still needed planning. The work never stopped, and neither would she. On the 8th day, the numbers didn't lie. Clara sat in the wagon bed at dawn, taking inventory by the light of a single lantern, her ledger open, her expression growing more grave with each calculation. Flour was down to 20 pounds. Bacon was nearly gone. The dried beans that had sustained them for days were running low. Coffee, the one thing that kept morale from completely collapsing, would be gone in 3 days if she didn't start rationing cups. Wade found her there, walking over from the barn where he'd been checking the horses. "How bad?" he asked. He didn't ask how he knew something was wrong. "Bad enough that we need to make a decision," Clara said. "Either we push hard for the trading post and hope we can stretch what we have, or we send riders ahead to bring back emergency supplies." Wade climbed into the wagon and looked at her ledger, though the numbers wouldn't mean much to him. "Sending riders means splitting the crew when we can't afford to lose anyone." He paused. "Can you make it 5 more days?" Clara met his eyes. "If nothing else goes wrong, if the weather holds, if no more supplies disappear." She paused. "That's a lot of ifs." Wade's voice was quiet, not demanding, but genuinely asking. "What do you need?" The question caught her off guard. Not what could she manage, not what would be good enough. What did she need? "We could supplement with game," she said after a moment. "There's antelope out here, maybe deer if we get closer to the hills. Fresh meat would save the bacon for emergencies." "I'll take 2 men and hunt this afternoon." "What else?" "Forage. There's wild onions growing in some of these creek bottoms, and I've seen edible greens. It won't replace vegetables, but it'll help with variety and nutrition." "Show me what to look for. I'll have the men collect whatever they find." He paused. "What else?" Clara closed the ledger. "Honestly, I need the stealing to stop. Every missing pound makes this harder." Frustration edged Wade's voice. "I know. I've been watching, but whoever's doing it is smart about it. Small amounts, different items, never enough at once to be obvious. It's adding up to obvious now. I'll address it again tonight. Make it clear there will be consequences." He looked at her, really looked, and she saw the weight he was carrying. The responsibility for 30 men, 3,000 cattle, and a woman he'd taken a chance on who was now proving him right in ways that made others uncomfortable. "I'm sorry this is falling on you," he said. "It's my job." "It shouldn't be this hard." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "Everything worth doing is hard. If it was easy, Hayes would be doing it." That got a small smile from Wade, brief as summer lightning. Fair point. He left to organize the hunting party and foraging instructions. Clara turned her attention to breakfast. Oatmeal again stretched thin with extra water. A few strips of bacon for flavor, rationed carefully. Coffee that was weaker than she liked, but still hot and bracing. The men accepted their portions without complaint, though she saw disappointment in some faces. They were getting used to going hungry, and that worried her more than the depleted supplies. Hungry men made mistakes. Mistakes on a cattle drive could be fatal. That night brought disaster. Clara woke to shouting and ran from her tent to find chaos. The horse line had broken in the night. Someone had tied a knot wrong or deliberately wrong, and when one horse spooked, the whole line pulled free. Now a dozen horses were scattered across the prairie, some running, others just grazing free, and the men were scrambling to catch them before they disappeared entirely. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the confusion, several steers had panicked and bolted from the main herd. Wade was already mounted and riding hard after them, along with 3 other drovers. The rest of the crew was torn between chasing horses and containing the cattle. And in the middle of everything, Clara discovered that the water barrels on the chuck wagon had been upended in the night. Every drop of their fresh water supply was soaked into the ground, leaving them with nothing. She stood staring at the empty barrels and felt something crack inside her chest. The nearest creek was 3 miles back. They'd passed it yesterday afternoon. Going back would mean losing half a day, maybe more. But they couldn't go forward without water, not in this heat. Ben ran up out of breath. "Miss Bennett, what do we do?" Clara's voice was calmer than she felt. "Get me every container we have. Canteens, pots, buckets, anything that holds liquid. We're going back to that creek." "But the herd will wait. Men and horses can't." She was already moving toward the wagon, mentally cataloging what she'd need. "Get the mules hitched. We're leaving in 10 minutes. She found Silas trying to calm a nervous horse. "I need to take the wagon back to the creek for water. Can you spare anyone to ride with me?" "Take Ben, everyone else is needed here." He glanced at the chaos around them. "Damn mess. Someone really fouled up that knot work." Clara's voice was low. "Or did it deliberately?" Silas's eyes sharpened. "You think this was sabotage?" "I think upended water barrels and a broken horse line on the same night is too much coincidence, but I can't prove anything." "Neither can I, but I'm starting to have the same suspicions as Marsh." He handed her his canteen. "Take this, and be careful on the road. Not just of the wagon, of whoever's causing problems." The trip back to the creek took 2 hours. Clara drove the mules hard but not recklessly, while Ben rode alongside on his horse, keeping watch. The prairie that had seemed vast and empty on the way out now felt exposed and dangerous. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound made her jump. When they reached the creek, it was running lower than yesterday. Clara felt her stomach drop. If the water kept dropping, they'd be in real trouble come tomorrow. They filled every container they had, working quickly and efficiently. Ben watered his horse while Clara secured the barrels, making absolutely certain the stoppers were tight and the barrels were properly lashed to the wagon. "Miss Bennett," Ben's voice was uncertain, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you do this?" "Not just the cooking, but all of it. The hard work, the disrespect, the constant proving yourself. You could find easier work somewhere." Clara paused in her work and looked at the young man. He reminded her of herself at that age, full of questions about fairness and wondering why the world worked the way it did. "I do this because I'm good at it," she said finally. "And because the moment I stop, the moment I choose easier work, just because it's easier, I'm letting people like Hayes win. I'm agreeing that I don't belong here, that my say or my gender makes me less capable." She secured the last barrel and met his eyes. "I won't give them that satisfaction." "But don't you get tired of fighting all the time?" Clara smiled, but it was edged with weariness. "Every single day. But I get more tired thinking about giving up, about spending the rest of my life wondering what I could have accomplished if I'd just been braver." Ben nodded, slowly processing that. "For what it's worth, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." "That's kind of you, but bravery and stubbornness look awful similar from the outside." They headed back to camp, the wagon heavy with water. When they arrived, the situation had stabilized somewhat. Most of the horses had been caught and resecured this time, with proper knots checked by 3 different people. The cattle were back with the main herd, though Wade and the others who chased them looked exhausted. That evening, after a hasty meal, Wade gathered the entire crew. The atmosphere was tense, everyone aware that something serious was coming. Wade stood in the center, his posture radiating controlled anger. "We've had 3 major incidents in 3 days," he said without preamble. "Missing supplies, upended water barrels, a broken horse line that scattered our animals and our herd. Men shifted uncomfortably, looking at each other with suspicion. Individually, these could be accidents. Together, they're a pattern. He paused. I don't know who's responsible, but I know this. Whoever it is, they're not just targeting Miss Bennett. They're endangering every man here. His voice hardened. We're in the middle of hostile country with limited supplies and brutal weather. We can't afford sabotage. We can't afford division. We either work together or we all suffer. Tucker spoke up from the back. You sure it's sabotage, boss? Maybe it's just someone who can't handle the job, making excuses for why things keep going wrong. The implication was clear. The silence that followed was deadly. Wade took 3 steps toward Tucker, and the crowd parted to let him through. You want to make an accusation, Hayes? His voice was soft and absolutely lethal. Make it plain. Tell everyone here exactly what you're suggesting. Tucker's courage faltered in the face of Wade's cold fury. I'm just saying maybe we're looking at this wrong. No, you're saying Miss Bennett is incompetent or a liar, which is rich coming from a man who's contributed nothing but complaints since this drive started. Wade's gaze swept the crowd. Miss Bennett has kept us fed through heat supply shortages and now outright sabotage. She's worked longer hours than any of us. She solved problems that would have ended this drive before it started. He paused. And some of you thank her by stealing her supplies, undermining her authority, and making her job 10 times harder than it needs to be. His voice dropped, became even more dangerous. Here's how things are going to work from here on. Anyone caught stealing, tampering with equipment, or otherwise sabotaging this operation will be sent back to Thornfield on foot. No pay, no reference. I don't care if you've worked for me 10 years or 10 days. The rules are the same for everyone. He paused. And if I find out that someone's been deliberately targeting Miss Bennett because of her gender, or any other damn reason except her actual work, they'll have more to worry about than lost wages. Are we clear? Murmurs of assent, though Tucker looked mutinous. I said, are we clear? This time the response was stronger, more unified. Clear, boss. Good, now get some rest. We've got a hard day tomorrow, and I expect everyone to pull their weight. No exceptions. The men dispersed, but the tension remained. Later that night, Marsh appeared beside Clara as she was banking the fire, moving so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. It's Hayes, he said without preamble. I'm sure of it now. Saw him messing with the horse line 2 nights ago. Didn't realize what he was doing until after it broke. And I'd bet my wages he dumped those water barrels. Can you prove it? Clara asked. Not enough to make it stick in front of Wade. But I'm watching him close now. He slips up again, I'll catch him. Marsh paused. You should know he's not working alone. Got at least one other man helping him, maybe 2. Who? Still figuring that out, but they're coordinating. This isn't just one angry man, it's a conspiracy. The words sent ice down Clara's spine. A conspiracy meant planning. Organization, it meant Hayes and his allies were serious about driving her off this trail. And they wouldn't stop until they succeeded or were stopped. What do I do? Marsh's expression softened slightly. You do what you've been doing. Keep your head down, do your work, stay alert. Let Wade and me handle Hayes. You just focus on getting us to that trading post in 3 days. He paused. Once we're resupplied, his main argument goes away. Hard to claim you're incompetent when everyone's eating well. He was right. The trading post was the key. If she could get them there with everyone fed and functional, she'd prove her capability beyond any doubt. 3 more days. She could do 3 more days. She had to. On the morning they should have reached the trading post, Clara woke to find the Dutch oven missing. She stood in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at the empty space where the heavy cast iron pot should have been, and felt something crack inside her chest. The Dutch oven was essential, irreplaceable. Without it, she couldn't bake bread, couldn't slow cook stews, couldn't do half the things that made trail food palatable. It was the heart of her operation, and someone had stolen it on the very day they needed to make it to resupply. This wasn't just theft. This was a targeted attack. She searched the entire wagon twice, then the area around camp, then sent Ben to check if someone had borrowed it and forgotten to return it. But she already knew the truth. Someone had taken it deliberately. Someone wanted to cripple her ability to feed the crew properly on the day it mattered most. Wade found her standing by the wagon, her hands shaking with a rage so pure it scared her. What happened? Clara's voice was flat, emptied of emotion because if she let herself feel anything, she'd break. The Dutch oven. It's gone. I checked it last night before I slept. It was there. Now it's not. Wade's jaw set like granite. Marsh, the older man, appeared within seconds as if he'd been waiting for this. Dutch oven's missing. Where's Hayes? Last I saw, he was by the horse line with Decker and Morris. Get them! All three, now! While Marsh went to collect the men, Wade turned back to Clara. Can you manage breakfast without it? Clara was already adjusting her mental plans. I'll have to. Fried cornmeal cakes instead of proper bread. Coffee. Whatever bacon scraps remain. She paused. It will be meager, but it will be food. Hayes, Decker, and Morris arrived looking belligerent and wary in equal measure. Wade faced them with the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Dutch oven's missing from the chuck wagon. You three know anything about that? Why would we? Hayes's tone was defensive. We don't cook. That's not what I asked. Then no boss. We don't know nothing about it. Wade studied them with the intensity of a man reading livestock at auction, looking for the tell that would reveal the lie. Empty your saddlebags, all three of you. That's an order. Empty them now. Decker and Morris exchanged nervous glances, but complied, turning out their bags to reveal the usual assortment of personal items. Nothing incriminating. Hayes held out longer, his face flushed with anger and something else. Fear, maybe. I don't have to take this, Hayes said. You can't just accuse a man without proof. Wade's voice was deadly calm. I'm not accusing, I'm investigating. There's a difference. You got nothing to hide that shouldn't bother you. Hayes hesitated a moment too long, and that hesitation was damning. When he finally upended his saddlebag, a piece of cloth fell out, flour sacking that Clara recognized immediately as coming from her supplies. Not proof of taking the Dutch oven, but proof of something. That's from the chuck wagon, Clara said quietly. So could have picked it up anywhere. It's got my inventory mark on it. She stepped forward and pointed to the corner where she'd written the date and contents in pencil. I marked every sack when we loaded the wagon. That's from my supplies. The silence was absolute. Wade's voice when he spoke was colder than Clara had ever heard it. Last chance, Hayes. Tell me where the Dutch oven is, or you're walking back to Thornfield right now. I don't have your damn pot, but you've been stealing supplies. It wasn't a question. Hayes's face twisted with resentment. A little extra food here and there isn't stealing. It's theft from everyone on this drive. Wade turned to Decker and Morris. You two part of this? No, sir, Morris said quickly. We didn't know nothing about any stealing. That true, Decker. The younger man wouldn't meet Wade's eyes. Hayes said it was just making sure we got our fair share. Said she was holding back the good stuff. Wade's disgust was palpable. She was rationing to make supplies last. That's her job. He looked at both of them. Get your gear. You're done with this drive. Boss, please, Morris started. Now, before I change my mind about letting you walk back instead of dragging you. As Morris and Decker scrambled to collect their belongings, Hayes stood his ground, jaw set with stubborn fury. This is because of her, he said, jerking his chin toward Clara. You're choosing her over men who've worked for you for years. Wade stepped closer. I'm choosing competence over sabotage. Character over cruelty. He paused. You want to blame someone? Look in a mirror. You did this to yourself. She doesn't belong here. A woman like that doing men's work. It's not natural. Wade's voice could have cut steel. What's not natural is a man so threatened by a woman's competence that he has to undermine her to feel like a man. He pointed toward the road. Get your things. You've got 10 minutes. Then I want you gone. Hayes opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to recognize something in Wade's expression that made further protest futile. He stalked off toward his bedroll, radiating impotent rage. Marsh searched Hayes's gear while the man was packing, returned empty-handed. Not there, he either hid it somewhere on the trail or someone else took it. Wade's expression was grim. Doesn't matter now. We're down 3 men and we still have a herd to move. He turned to Clara. Can you manage without the Dutch oven? Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. I don't have a choice. Clara, I need to start breakfast. We're burning daylight. Hayes, Morris, and Decker left 20 minutes later, walking back the way they'd come with canteens and enough food for 3 days. No one said goodbye. The herd moved out under a sky that promised heat. Clara followed in the wagon, her mind working through calculations. If they reached the trading post by evening, she could restock everything. Get a new Dutch oven, or at least a suitable substitute. Replenish the flour and coffee, and all the things that had been stolen or depleted. Tomorrow would be better. She just had to survive today. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. 2 hours into the day's drive, a shout went up from the front of the herd. Clara couldn't see what was happening from her position, but she heard the commotion. Cattle bawling, men yelling, the thunder of hooves. Then Silas came racing back on his horse, his face grim. Creeks flooded. Recent storm upstream must have sent runoff down. It's running high and fast. Too dangerous to cross with the herd. Clara's heart sank. How long to go around? Could be hours. Could be a full day if we have to find another crossing point. He looked at her with sympathy. I know you were counting on reaching the post today. Can some of us ford across, get to the trading post, while the herd finds another route? Silas shook his head. Too risky. Current strong enough to take a horse down. We're stuck till it drops or we find an alternative. Clara climbed down from the wagon and walked to where she could see the creek. Silas hadn't exaggerated. What should have been a shallow ford was now a churning brown torrent carrying debris and foam. Even standing on the bank, she could feel the power of it. Wade rode up beside her, his horse dancing nervously near the water's edge. We'll head upstream. There might be a narrower crossing, but it's going to take time. We don't have time. Wade's voice was quiet. How much food do we have left? He probably already knew, but he was asking anyway. Enough for one more meal. Maybe two if I stretch it to the point of cruelty. Clara looked at this raging water and felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her. After that, we're out. Then we find that crossing fast. He turned his horse. Stay with the wagon. I'm taking 3 men to scout upstream. They were gone for 4 hours. 4 hours during which Clara prepared the midday meal with the grim knowledge that this might be the last proper food the men ate for days. She used everything she had left. The final scoops of flour made into thin Johnny cakes, the dregs of the coffee boiled strong, the last strips of bacon fried crisp and divided into portions so small they were more symbolic than sustaining. The men ate in silence, understanding, without being told, that this was all there was. No one complained. Even the most skeptical among them could see the empty supply crates, the bare shelves, and the chuck wagon. When Wade returned, his expression told Clara everything she needed to know before he said a word. There's no good crossing for at least 10 miles upstream, and the creek's still rising. We'd be adding a full day, maybe more, to reach it. He dismounted heavily. And there was something else. Storm's coming. Big one from the look of the sky. We've got maybe 3 hours before it hits. Clara looked west and saw the wall of dark clouds building on the horizon. Lightning flickered in their depths like trapped fire. What do we do? The question came from Ben, but every man in earshot was listening for the answer. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he calculated impossible odds. Finally, he turned to Clara. With everything falling apart, with supplies gone and a storm bearing down, he was still asking what she needed. What do you need? The question caught her off guard. What did she need? A miracle, divine intervention? No. She needed to think like the cook she was, not the victim she refused to become. I need whatever game we can get. Birds, rabbits, anything. And I need every man who knows edible plants to gather whatever they can find before that storm hits. Wade's response was immediate. Done. He raised his voice to the crew. Anyone who can shoot, you're hunting. Anyone who knows plants, you're foraging with Miss Bennett. We've got 3 hours to gather enough food to get through the next 2 days. Move. The camp exploded into purposeful chaos. Men scattered in all directions. Hunters heading into the brush with rifles. Foragers following Clara along the creek bank. She worked with fierce efficiency, pointing out plants and explaining quickly which parts were edible. These are cattail roots, starchy filling. Dig up as many as you can. Those greens there, that's lamb's quarters. Tastes like spinach. See those bushes, wild plums? They're small and tart, but they're food. The men worked without complaint, filling sacks with whatever she indicated. Some of them clearly thought they were gathering weeds, but they trusted her expertise enough to follow instructions. Ben stayed close, absorbing everything she taught. "How do you know all this?" he asked as they pulled up wild onions. "Learned it from an old cook in Montana who'd survived a winter snowed in with no supplies. She taught me that food is everywhere if you know where to look." Clara pulled up a handful of the pungent bulbs. "Cities make people forget that. Make them think food only comes from stores." "I won't forget," Ben said, his voice serious. "After this, I'll always know." The hunters returned with 3 rabbits, a dozen sage grouse, and a young turkey. It wasn't much for 30 men, but combined with the foraged plants, it was something. Clara worked with frantic speed, preparing everything before the storm hit. She showed several of the men how to pluck and clean the birds while she butchered the rabbits. The cattail roots went into a pot to boil. The wild plums would be a relish. The greens would bulk up the stew. Every scrap would be used. The first drops of rain began to fall just as she got the cooking fires going. Within minutes, it became a deluge. Men scrambled to secure the herd and set up what shelter they could. The camp descended into chaos as wind whipped through, tearing at tents and sending loose items tumbling across the prairie. Clara worked in the rain, her clothes soaked through her hands, shaking from cold and exhaustion. She kept the fire going through sheer stubborn will, protecting it with her body and the wagon's bulk. The stew bubbled in the pot, wild and strange tasting, but hot and nourishing. The birds roasted on improvised spits. The cattail roots softened. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because if she stopped, if she let the fire die or the food spoil, then Hayes would have been right. She would have failed. Wade appeared beside her, shouting over the storm, "Get under cover. Food's not ready. Clara, you're going to get struck by lightning." "Then I'll get struck. These men need to eat." He stared at her for a long moment, rain streaming down his face, then made a decision. He stayed right there beside her in the rain, helping tend the fire, helping protect the food. He didn't try to convince her to stop. He just worked alongside her. 2 people against a storm that didn't care about their determination. Other men saw what was happening and came to help. Silas appeared with canvas to rig a makeshift shelter over the cooking area. Ben and Marsh built a windbreak from supply crates. Soon there were a dozen men working together to keep the fire alive and the food cooking. No one had ordered them, no one had asked. They just came. The work happened in silence. No words exchanged. Just bodies moving in coordination. Hands passing tools before they were requested. Men positioning themselves to block wind without being told where to stand. The only sounds were rain, thunder, the crack and hiss of firefighting water. Wood hitting wood as the windbreak grew higher. Wade's hand on her shoulder steadying her when the wind nearly knocked her over. Silas adjusting the canvas without a word, his weathered face set with determination. Ben anticipating what she'd need next, handing her the ladle before she reached for it. Marsh standing like a wall between her and the worst of the wind. A dozen men, silent, working, not because she'd asked, but because they'd chosen. When the meal was finally ready and Clara rang the triangle, the men came through the rain without hesitation. She served them one by one, her hands steady despite her exhaustion, and watched them eat food that had been scavenged from the prairie itself. No one complained about the strange taste of cattail roots or the gamey flavor of wild turkey. They ate with the gratitude of people who understood how close they'd come to going hungry. The storm raged for hours, but the camp held. The herd stayed together. And when dawn came gray and cold, the creek had dropped enough to attempt a crossing. They made it across in a tense hour. The cattle balking at the still swift current, but the men worked together with the kind of coordination that came from shared adversity. By mid-morning, they were on the other side and the trading post was visible in the distance. A cluster of rough buildings that looked like salvation. Clara drove the wagon up to the post supply depot and climbed down on legs that barely held her. The proprietor, Horace, who delivered supplies to the ranch before, took one look at her mud-caked, exhausted state and whistled low. "Heard you folks had some trouble on the trail." "You could say that." Clara pulled out her supply list. "I need everything on this list. And a new Dutch oven if you have one." "Got one in the back, good and heavy." He scanned her list. "This is going to take some time to pull together." "I'll wait." She did wait, sitting on the porch of the trading post while Horace and his assistants gathered in supplies. Wade came to find her there carrying 2 cups of real coffee from the post dining room. "Thought you might need this." Clara took the cup and wrapped her cold hands around it, savoring the warmth. Thank you. He sat beside her, and for a while they just sat in silence, watching the men move about the post, getting supplies, getting hot meals, getting their first real rest in days. You saved this drive, Wade said finally. When Hayes was stealing supplies, when the water got dumped, when we lost the Dutch oven and got stuck at the creek. Any one of those things could have ended us. You found a way through all of it. We found a way, Clara corrected. I couldn't have done it alone. But you led the way. You showed us it was possible. He turned to look at her. I want you to know something. When we get back to Thornfield at the end of this drive, I'm offering you a permanent position. Clara's breath caught. Not just as trail cook, Wade continued. As the ranch cook year-round, fair pay, and a place of your own on the property. He paused. I know it's not a fancy position, and the town will probably keep gossiping. But you'd have stability, a home, and respect from everyone who matters. Another pause. You've earned that, more than earned it. Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw not pity or obligation, but genuine respect. He wasn't offering her charity. He was offering her what she'd always wanted, a place where her skill mattered more than her appearance. I accept, she said quietly. Thank you. Something shifted in Wade's expression, a softening that made him look younger. Thank you for giving me a second chance to do the right thing. Clara smiled, tired but genuine. We both got second chances. Seems only fair we make the most of them. The rest of the drive passed without major incident. With supplies restocked and the saboteurs gone, the crew settled into an efficient rhythm. The men who'd been neutral or skeptical became openly supportive. Marsh appointed himself Clara's unofficial protector, though she needed protecting from nothing more dangerous than the occasional curious coyote. Ben continued his education in trail cooking and foraging, absorbing everything Clara taught with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a mentor. Silas brought her wildflowers most mornings, a gesture of respect that never required acknowledgement. And Wade stopped maintaining quite so much distance. He still ate last and worked hardest, but sometimes he'd linger after meals to talk about the ranch, about his plans for the future, about small things that didn't matter much, but somehow mattered more because they were shared. Clara found herself looking forward to those conversations, found herself hoping they wouldn't end when the drive did. 3 months later, when they finally drove the herd into the pens at the railroad depot and the drovers let out a collective cheer, Clara felt something she'd never felt at the end of a job before. Not relief that it was over, but satisfaction that it had been completed well. The men lined up to shake her hand before they headed to town for their pay and their celebrations. Even the ones who doubted her at the start offered genuine thanks. Best food I've had on a drive, Miss Bennett, one old-timer said, and I've been doing this 30 years. You're welcome to work any outfit I'm on. Silas told her it would be an honor. Ben hugged her outright, much to his own embarrassment. Thank you for everything you taught me. You keep practicing, Clara said. You've got real talent. When everyone else had gone and it was just her and Wade loading the chuck wagon for the trip back to Thornfield, he paused in his work and looked at her seriously. I meant what I said at the trading post. The position's yours if you still want it. I want it. Wade seemed relieved, as if he'd been worried she might change her mind. Good, because I've been thinking about the future, about what the ranch could be with someone like you making it a home again. Clara's heart beat a little faster. Someone like me. Someone who doesn't give up when things get hard. Someone who finds solutions instead of excuses. Someone, he stopped seeming to choose his words carefully. Someone I trust. It was a simple word, but coming from a man who'd been betrayed by loss and learned to guard his heart, it meant everything. I trust you too, Clara said softly. They finished loading the wagon as the sun set over the depot, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow, they'd start the journey back to Thornfield, back to a town that would gossip and judge, but whose opinions mattered less now than they had before, because Clara had proven to the men, to Wade, and most importantly, to herself, that she belonged exactly where she was. When they arrived back at the ranch 2 weeks later, Wade was true to his word. He helped her move into the small house near the cookhouse. 2 rooms with a real bed, a stove, and windows that let in morning light. He paid her fairly, treated her with respect, and slowly, carefully, over weeks and months, built something with her that looked like partnership. The town eventually stopped talking, or maybe Clara just stopped caring what they said. Mrs. Whitmore and her friends could whisper all they wanted. It didn't change the fact that Clara had a home meaningful work and the respect of people whose opinions actually mattered. One evening, nearly a year after that first difficult drive, Clara was preparing dinner in the ranch cookhouse when Wade came in carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a book, a professional cookbook with leather binding and gold lettering. But when she opened it, she found blank pages. "It's for you to write your own recipes," Wade explained. "All the things you've learned, all the ways you make something from nothing. Ben's been asking if you could teach him properly, and I thought maybe you could use this to organize your knowledge." Clara ran her fingers over the blank pages and felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know what to say." Wade's voice was quiet but certain. "Say you'll stay, not just as the cook, but as," he paused, then finished simply, "as the person who makes this place a home." Clara looked up at him and saw in his face the same thing she felt in her heart. Something that had started as a second chance and grown into something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them needed. "I'll stay," she said, "for as long as you'll have me." Wade smiled when he said it, and Clara smiled back. The dinner bell rang out across the ranch, calling everyone home to a meal made with care by a woman who'd finally found where she belonged. Not because someone had rescued her or felt sorry for her, but because she'd proven her worth in the crucible of the trail and earned her place through skilled determination and the stubborn refusal to be anything less than fully herself. The ranch hands filed in for dinner, their voices filling the cookhouse with warmth and life. Clara served them the way she always did, with generous portions and quiet pride. And when Wade caught her eye across the crowded room and nodded once in acknowledgement, she felt something settle in her chest that she'd been missing her whole life. Belonging. Not granted as a favor, but earned through fire and hardship, and proving that she was exactly as capable as she'd always known herself to be. The fire had burned down to embers in the ranch house. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving the world wrapped in white silence. Tommy looked up from the journal, his eyes wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. Wade Harrison sat across from him, 92 years old, but with eyes that still burned with the memory of that summer 49 years ago. "She never gave up," Tommy said softly. "Not once, even when everything was against her." "Your grandmother," Wade said, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "didn't give up once in 49 years. Not when the work was hard, not when people judged her, not when it would have been easier to quit." He leaned forward slightly. "She just solved problems. That's who she was." Tommy set the journal down carefully as if it were something precious, which it was. "I quit my job because the head chef said I didn't belong in fine dining, that my background was wrong." His voice was thick. "But grandmother Clara, she didn't let anyone tell her where she belonged." Wade's expression softened. "Your grandmother taught me that worth isn't determined by others' prejudice. It's determined by the work you do and the character you show." He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had been his life's work. She proved herself every single day, not because she had to, but because that's who she was. Tommy stood too, moving to stand beside his grandfather. "Tomorrow Walter arrives," he said quietly. "Everyone expects you to choose him. He's successful, educated. He has prospects." Wade turned to face his grandson fully. "Your brother is successful in the city, but this ranch needs someone who loves it, someone who will fight for it, someone who understands that worth doesn't come from titles or degrees." He paused, his hand coming to rest on Tommy's shoulder. "It comes from showing up every day and doing the work no matter how hard it gets, just like your grandmother did." Tommy's breath caught. "Grandfather, are you saying—" Wade nodded. "This ranch is yours, Tommy. You've earned it. Not because you're my grandson, but because you didn't give up when everyone said you weren't good enough. Because you showed up, you worked hard, you cared." He squeezed Tommy's shoulder. "Because you understand what Clara taught me all those years ago." "What's that?" Wade looked at the journal on the table, at Clara's handwriting, at the record of a woman who'd refused to be diminished. That the measure of a person isn't what others think of them, it's what they do when everyone says they can't. Tommy felt something break open in his chest. Not sadness, but something like hope. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Wade smiled. You've got her stubbornness and her heart. That's all any good thing needs. The old man moved back to his chair by the fire, settling into it with a sigh. Now, about that restaurant you mentioned. Claire, as you said, Tommy nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. I want to serve the kind of honest food she would have made. And when people ask about the name, I'll tell them this story. Wade's smile deepened. She would have liked that. She always said food was about bringing people together, about showing them they matter. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every one of his 92 years. Your grandmother fed my body and saved my soul. That's what I wrote in her journal after she passed, because it was true then and it's true now. Tommy sat down again, pulling the journal toward him. Opening to the first page. In Clara's handwriting, careful and clear. If my size offends you, don't taste my food. But if you do taste it with an open heart, because that's how I made it. And below that, in Wade's older, shakier hand, added many years later, she fed my body and saved my soul, W.H. Tommy traced the words with his finger, feeling the weight of legacy settling onto his shoulders. Not a burden, but a gift. Don't let anyone make you small, son. Wade's voice was quiet now, drifting toward sleep. The world has enough small men. Be like Clara, take up space, earn your place, and never apologize for being exactly who you are. Tommy sat with the journal as his grandfather dozed by the fire. Outside, the Wyoming winter held the land in its grip, but inside, a different kind of warmth had taken root. The warmth of a story told, of a legacy passed, of a young man beginning to understand that deserving something and earning something were not the same thing at all. And somewhere in the pages of that journal, in the recipes and notes and observations of a woman who'd fought for her place in a world that said she didn't belong, Tommy found the answer he'd been looking for. Not who deserves the ranch, but who will fight for it. Not who others think should inherit, but who has proven themselves through work and character and stubborn refusal to quit. He looked at his grandfather sleeping peacefully now by the dying fire, and he understood. Worth wasn't given, it was earned. One day at a time, one meal at a time, one choice at a time, to show up and do the work even when everyone said you couldn't. Clara Bennett Harrison had taught Wade that lesson in the summer of 1883. And 49 years later, Wade was passing it on. Tomorrow, Walter would arrive from Denver with his law degree and his expectations. But tonight, Tommy Harrison sat with his grandmother's journal and understood that he'd already been chosen. Not because he was smart or successful or what everyone expected, but because he'd shown up when no one else would, because he'd done the work, because he loved this place enough to fight for it, just like Clara had fought for her place at the chuck wagon, just like Wade had fought to become a better man, just like every person who'd ever earned something worth having. The fire died on ash, the snow stopped falling, and in the silence of the Wyoming night, a legacy passed from one generation to the next. Not through words or wishes, but through the simple, profound truth that your worth is measured by what you do, not what others think of you. And that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't land or money or status. It's the knowledge that you belong because you earned it, that you matter because you showed up, that you're enough exactly as you are because you refuse to let anyone make you small. Tommy closed the journal carefully and carried it upstairs to his room. Tomorrow would bring his brother in explanations and probably arguments. But tonight he had his answer. He had his grandmother's example. He had his grandfather's trust. And he had the ranch that would be his, not because it was given, but because it was earned. In the morning, he would start proving himself all over again, just like Clara had done every single day for 49 years, one meal at a time, one choice at a time, one moment at a time of refusing to be anything less than exactly who he was meant to be. And that, Tommy thought as he drifted off to sleep with the journal on his nightstand, was worth more than any inheritance money could buy. It was worth everything.